Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, I'm Klevit here, the host of the System Simplified podcast, where I feature top founders, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And today's episode is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group, where we create, document, optimize, and implement processes and procedures so businesses can grow and thrive. And today's guest is Jonathan Small. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So we need to give a big shout out to our mutual friend, Anna David, who introduced us. And I did a great podcast with Anna. Anna is all about, I'm going to put the link to the show in the notes, in these notes, the podcast that I recorded with Anna, because it's all about how books are important in order to create yourself as a thought leader and like why entrepreneurs should actually publish their books. So we're going to talk about books.
Yeah, books are important.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about with you because you are an author of a best-selling book, which is Right About Now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a play on word, of course. It's Right, yes. W-R-I-T-E, Right About Now. And you're an entrepreneur, you're a journalist. You know, there's a lot to talk here. And we're going to discuss why telling your story is so important, you know, for entrepreneurs as well, and how to use it in order to build your own credibility and brand, etc. But first, tell us a little bit about your life story, about your journey.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. Very excited to be here. My life's journey, it all begins. I guess you could you could start from the time I was just a temp worker at a magazine called Child Magazine. I was basically a receptionist. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I graduated from college. I knew I sort of liked to write, but I wasn't really sure. And somebody gave me a job, just answering the phone for this magazine. And I was there for a bunch of weeks and started becoming sort of friendly with the editors, but, you know, just because they'd be passing by the desk and they'd say hello and I'd say hello. And, you know, I told them I was a writer, but not a serious writer. And one day, I was sitting there answering the phone and somebody said, "Hey, do you have 10 minutes? We have a little bit of a crisis here." And I said, "Well, what's the crisis?" And they said, "Well, we have to interview George Carlin, who, for those of you who don't know, is a famous comedian, passed away, but was a very famous comedian in the States." And he said, "You know, he's got a new TV show coming up and we need to interview him." And I said, "Well, yeah, so?" And they said, "Well, we want you to interview him because nobody has time here." And so I all of a sudden was asked to interview George Carlin, who was like basically an A-list celebrity at the time and had no experience, no right to interview this guy, but whatever. What am I supposed to do? Say no? So they got on the phone with him. I had 10 minutes to prepare for the interview. I got on the phone and interviewed him. I wrote up a story about my interview and they loved it. And they said, "Okay, well, would you like to now become an editorial assistant," which is the lowest job on the food chain of a magazine at the time. But I said, "Of course." And that was the birth of my career in magazine journalism. I had absolutely no experience. I wasn't a journalism major. You know, I enjoyed writing in college, but I never considered myself a writer. And just, you know, from that job at Child Magazine, which was a parenting magazine that was published by the New York Times in New York. And I worked my way up the ladder there and then began my career in magazine journalism and worked at magazines such as Glamour magazine and Cosmo and Maxim magazine and Fitness magazine. A lot of the magazines I work for don't even exist anymore, which is very sad. Child also doesn't exist. But this was a time in the 90s when magazines were flourishing and everybody wanted to be working in magazines. And that was the origin of my career as a magazine editor and writer. And I found over the years, I've had to pivot a few times because, as we all know, nobody really reads print magazines anymore. So even though it was a big deal in the 90s, the internet came along in the 2000s and totally destroyed the magazine business, the print magazine business. So I transitioned into digital magazines, digital journalism. but also found that I had an expertise in creating videos. And I'm sort of an example. Sometimes people call me Mr. Pivot because I've always had to kind of trying to change directions when an industry becomes obsolete, or when I've had to kind of pivot. So I've worked in video. I worked for the Game Show Network, and for YouTube for a little bit of a while. And then I discovered later, when video wasn't making me any money anymore, I discovered podcasting. And so I launched a podcast called Right About Now, which is a podcast that I host every week, and realized that I really enjoyed doing podcasting. It was everything that I ever really wanted to do in my life was sort of wrapped up into one platform. I could be a journalist. I could also be a host, which I always really enjoyed. I could talk to interesting people, and I just love the format so much. And one thing led to another, and other people asked me, well, how did you start a podcast? And I realized there was a business opportunity there. And so I started helping other people and other companies launch their own podcast, and started a new company called Strike Fire Productions, and have a bunch of clients now who are companies. One of my biggest clients is the SAG-AFTRA, which is the Screen Actors Guild, which does the SAG Awards, et cetera. And I have a bunch of businesses as well that work with me, and I help them launch their podcast. So I went from being a journalist in magazines to now being a podcast producer and teacher, and now author of a new book called Right About Now. So
good. So let's talk about, that's an amazing story, Jonathan.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
It's been a while. It was many years condensed into a 5-minute monologue, but yes.
Amazing story. So tell us about your book, Right About Now.
So my book is one of the things I always do, and is exactly what you just did on your podcast. One of the things I always do on my podcast is I ask people to tell me how they got started. And on Right About Now, I interview pretty well-known famous authors like Ken Follett and David Gran and Sue Monk Kidd, and people who are pretty well-known, either journalists or authors. And I always ask them, in the beginning of the show, tell me a little bit about our origin story. How did you get started? And it turned out that was a very popular part of the show, because I think a lot of the people listening were curious how these really successful people, got their start. I think they found those stories inspirational. They found the stories relatable in a lot of ways, interesting, et cetera. And of course, people who make a living as storytellers are often good storytellers. And so that was helpful. So when I was thinking about making my podcast into a book, and how do I sort of take it to the next level, my podcast, how do I position myself as sort of more of an expert in the space? And I was talking to our mutual friend, Anna David, and she said, you should write a book. And so this was a book that is sort of half written and half portions from the podcast, sort of the best of transcripts from the podcast of origin stories of some of the most well-known people that I spoke to over the years on the podcast. And it's sort of like just good, fun stories about how these people got started. And I've sort of taken that theme of origin stories and recently started, writing articles for magazines like Entrepreneur about the origin stories of business leaders as well, because I found that even though I've interviewed a lot of authors, I've also interviewed a lot of business leaders, because one of my jobs until very recently was an editor at Entrepreneur magazine. So I've had a lot of experience interviewing authors as well, business leaders as well. So that is what my book is about. It's about the beginnings. It's about getting started and how people push through all the challenges and the obstacles and the hurdles and launch their careers.
Interesting. So, our listeners right now are entrepreneurs, okay?
Mm-hmm.
They are either the owners of fast-growing companies that are lacking consistency, or they are looking maybe at selling and they want to systematize. So we're all about systems, right?
Yeah.
And why is it, because I've seen it, I've seen a lot of websites of entrepreneurs, and sometimes you go to the about page and you read about the person, right? I mean, you read about Right Now, they are a leader of this and a leader of that and a leader of that. And really, when I look and I actually read the history, how I got started, I actually did it last week. I was looking at somebody's website and there was like this origin, like how did they get started? And I definitely I really get drawn to it, because then you get the connection with the person, right? And that's what you're talking about. So from your perspective, why do you think it's important to actually emphasize those origin stories?
Well, there's a few reasons. I think first, everybody has their own origin story, and no two origin stories are really the same. So right off the bat, it's really what makes you unique. It's a point of differentiation for you. And I think a lot of times, businesses struggle or are trying to always find a point of differentiation in their business between other businesses. So nobody is ever going to have the same origin story as you, and if they do, that's kind of weird. So origin stories definitely make you unique. And so that, again, point of difference, very important. They also make you authentic, to your customer. An origin story, hearing how an entrepreneur or how a business got their start, and being really transparent and honest about, all the challenges and the obstacles you had to overcome makes you more human to your customer. And I think that's a super important facet of a business that you want to communicate to your audience. And of course, they can also be very inspirational, especially if you or somebody like a Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, or somebody like Howard Schultz with Starbucks, where people who kind of started very small. Jobs obviously famously started Apple in a garage. Schultz started Starbucks with just one little measly, coffee shop in downtown Seattle, and then built these incredible empires out of it. So I think there's something, those three factors are super relatable about origin stories. And I think there's a reason that, we pay money in movie theaters to see, the origin story of Wolverine, or, the origin story of Luke Skywalker, or whoever it is. Comic books figured this out a long time ago, that people love to know the beginnings of companies or people that they admire.
So funny, because I remember like my favorite episode, like when I was a kid, and I was watch Wonder Woman, right?
Yeah.
So there was one episode that was actually like the origin of Wonder Woman, like how did she become Wonder Woman, and it was one of my favorite episodes.
Right. There's something I've always been drawn to it, and in fact, whenever I'm reading an autobiography or something of somebody I really like, for some reason I always like the beginning when they're first starting, and then I get less interested when I kind of, when it starts getting to be to the point where we're more in the kind of like their adult life. Like I like finding out how they became so successful.
Right.
I find that really interesting.
So what if we have an entrepreneur right now that listen to us and said, hey, my story is not that interesting. I grew up in a suburb, in a city in America, in a nice home. I went to high school, I went to college, and then I got started. I mean, they don't find I grew up, as an orphan in some third world country, and then this happened and that happened. And what if the story is not there, or they think story is not there?
Well, first of all, every story is interesting. It's just how you tell it. So I think that we'll just start by that premise, that I think every story is interesting.
I agree.
You probably,
so
and you might.
Give some advice. How can we tell those stories so they're interesting?
So one of the things I learned as a journalist is that a story is only interesting if you have a problem or a conflict or a challenge that you're overcoming, right? I think too many oftentimes entrepreneurs are tempted to sort of tell their story like a success, like this is how I became so successful, or this is why my company is so great. And there's no conflict, there's no tension in that story. And a good story requires tension. Now, I'm not saying you have to be negative, but let's face it, every company starts with a problem, right? Every brand has come to the fore to solve a problem. So right there, you have a conflict. There was a problem. I started my company to fix that problem. And so I think that's one way, is to step back and say, why did I get into this in the first place? What was the problem that I saw? What was the sort of thing that I needed to fix or solve? And I think just starting from that place will give you a good kind of launching pad to start thinking about your origin story in an interesting way. But remember, conflict sells. And that is something that you should always keep in mind.
Right. But we don't have to also
be negative.
Worried and negative.
No, it's not
that's
like,
what I don't like. That's conflict sells. We just talk about war will always sell newspapers, unfortunately, but I still think
Right.
that, we don't need to want to also
And
utilize
exactly.
it.
Yeah. Well, let me rephrase that. I think overcoming challenges sell. So if you have a
Because I think
challenge,
that I agree with you, because that is why, like, why do I go to movies? Like, my favorite movies are really inspirational movies. And I'm thinking, what makes it inspirational is because that person overcame the obstacles when others succumb to it, right?
yeah,
I mean, like
exactly.
we all like those sports stories that, somebody grew up in a neighborhood or in a place where had like zero chance of success, but they worked hard, and there was always the point where they felt like they're not going to be successful, but they put hard work, they trained, or they whatever, and then they had their breakthrough, but it's because of their own grit and their own persistence, and that's what we like to
I
see.
think that's what we like to see, and that people took a chance, that people, like took a risk and then were successful in taking the risk. Because of course, all entrepreneurs are taking a huge risk. I mean, I can relate to this because I'm an entrepreneur as well, and I've had failed businesses and I've had businesses that have done well. And we all know that, a many percent of entrepreneurs aren't going to, and businesses are going to fail. So to hear stories, including your own story of success in the face of, difficult odds is, I think, really a good story to tell. And so if your business is successful, or even if it's just kind of starting to be successful, or you're still trying to find your way, try to find that challenge that you've overcome. I always, when I interview entrepreneurs, I always ask them, what challenges have you overcome? And that is always probably the most interesting part of the interview, because honestly, people are not that interested in just hearing a success to success story. Nobody wants to hear you. If you went to a movie and it started off with Luke Skywalker was, had already beaten Darth Vader or whatever it is, had already saved the world, there wouldn't be a movie, right?
No.
Exactly.
But
So,
what also inspires me is purpose, hearing about people's purpose, what drove them through the challenge, right? Because overcame challenge A, B, and C, but I had my faith that I'm going to be successful, or I had that purpose of helping others. So I had a knowingness that I'm not going to fail, right? Or I had a belief in myself, like really hearing behind the scenes of, but also the honest saying, like, there were times where I hit bottom and I just completely thought, I mean, I was about
I was going to give up. Yeah.
give up, close my business, but then this and this happened, right? Because I think people can relate to that as well.
Yeah, I think purpose is like, what was your goal, and then what got in your way, and then what did you do to get past that? I think that is the root of every story ever told, and it seems like if you don't tell it that way, it's not going to be interesting. So that's one thing I would, if I was sitting down to understand what my origin story, what did I get, like you said, what was my purpose getting in there, and that's also be honest about your purpose. I mean, if it was just to make money, fine. So that's one. But I think a lot of times entrepreneurs don't just get into it to make money. There has to be something more driving them.
No, I mean, making money is I always say money is the reward, or money is the measurement of your success, right?
Yes.
Because if you're successful, you're going to make a lot of money, hopefully, or if you're good at what you do. But it's really because I interviewed, like, hundreds of people for my podcast as well. And the reason why I do my podcast is because I love interviewing people. I'm fascinated by their story. I always learn. And I can also say that the common denominator of all the successful entrepreneurs is that they had a strong purpose to do something, and they followed that purpose, that goal, that purpose. They had a dedication to what they want to do, and they're very clear about what they want to do. They might not always have been clear, but they are clear about something. They are clear about certain purpose that drives them forward, and it might not always come into fruition in the way that they thought. And that's what makes the story interesting, because, as you said, like, you're Mr. Pivot, but you have to be able to pivot, but your purpose is the same. It drives you forward, but then you're doing other things.
Yeah. And it's interesting. One of the things I've learned with a lot of the origin stories that I've studied is that it's never a clean, I wanted to do this and then this happened. It's people were flexible and they were willing to adapt and change and pivot, and they saw opportunities and they followed them. I mean, the story of MailChimp, for example, I don't know if you know that story, but these two guys that started MailChimp, they originally started MailChimp. MailChimp was originally, it wasn't even called MailChimp. these people ran a design company that was making sort of designs for, big businesses, website designs. On the side, they created a software that was what we sort of now know as MailChimp, a sort of way for people to communicate with each other through email. That was, at the time there was no services like MailChimp. They did that as a sort of a side hustle because their clients were complaining that they didn't have a good way of communicating with each other through email blasts or whatever. It was too complicated to do big email blasts like that. And the side hustle became the business because that was so popular that they realized they had created the software and so they made a pivot. They said, okay, the design company's fine, we'll keep that, but the actual real business here is the email communications business. And so they pivoted. And I think that's a good example of like when companies kind of are very flexible and adaptable, and again, are able to sort of see opportunities when they come. And that makes for a really interesting entrepreneurial story.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jonathan, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm sure our listeners got inspired to tell their story, to tell their origin, to be proud of it. So if they want to get your book, where should they go?
Anywhere you want to buy books, it is called Write About Now. It's WRITE About Now. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble. My name is Jonathan Small, so it's Write About Now by Jonathan Small. I also, very on brand, I have a podcast of the same name called Write About Now, so you can never forget who I am. It's funny, Ann and I struggled over what to call the book, and then I was like, shouldn't I just call it Write About Now? She's like, of course you should. Why did I not think of that? So Write About Now. I hope.
Beautiful. Okay,
yes.
so
and we're going to bring a deal. We're going to bring a deal on my podcast, so we'll look out for that for sure.
That's right. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and I definitely encourage our listeners to listen to your podcast, to subscribe to it, and to buy the book. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. That's been an amazing conversation.
I so enjoyed it. You're a great interviewer.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.